nawala. Huling taon ng pagsasama. Nasaan na kaya ang bawat isa? Mga sikretong di maitago, mga magulang di tayo maintindihan. Natutong umibig at may nabigo. Sabay na nung pangsanay, walang magbago. Hanggang doon na lang ba tayo? Sang alaalang maglalaho? Hanggang doon na lamang ba? Hinubog ang mga pangarap, binulat ang puso at diwa, patungo sa hamon ng bukas. Ikaw, ako, tayo.
Okay. Welcome to the Ateneo University Press book launching of Edilberto N. Alegre's Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue. I'm Alice Banyares, your host for this afternoon. To introduce the book, let me quote from our author, Edilberto Alegre. He said, "Traveling south, I gradually found our national culture. It was like going back to what we have forgotten in Luzon and even in the Visayas. What is in Mindanao that we may have lost in Luzon and Visayas? And how do travel, language, food, markets, and rituals, among other domains, lead to recognizing our similarities? And in our commonality, give shape to our national identity." This quote from Edilberto Alegre hints at the wide range of topics he writes about, and which we will explore this afternoon. Let me give you an overview of our various activities this afternoon. What author Edilberto Alegre would likely call a pagdiriwang. Miss Carolina Velasco, the director of the Ateneo University Press, will give a welcome message, followed by Dr. Prospero Covar of the University of the Philippines. Miss Lydia Anlumbo Pobre, a Manuvo teacher, will offer a folk song, followed by a dance performance of the Kirimteken Menuvo of the Bentangan community of North Cotabato. We have invited 4 expert speakers to give various perspectives and views in reaction to Edilberto Alegre's Biyaheng Pinoy. Brother Carl Gaspar, who wrote the foreword to this book. Miss Felice Santa Maria, for her perspective on food and culture. Professor Jane Rodriguez Tatel on Philippine languages, and Professor J. Jomar Quintos on folklore, arts, and cinema. After the talks, and before we entertain questions from the audience, there will be a musical performance to be presented by the UP and Balangao, and followed by a question and answer session. After, we have a message in behalf of Kagi Sahara, which will be shared with us by Ms. Norma Ali Cunanan of the Iranum Maguindanao community. A poetry performance will be presented by Lacan Uhay Alegre. And finally, Professor Joycie Dorado Alegre, wife of author Edilberto Alegre, will share how this book came into being. So this afternoon, join us in this pagdiriwang, which Ed Alegre would have loved, where there will be conversations, chants, storytelling, poetry performances, singing and dancing. And if we were face to face, Joycie Alegre and Felice Santa Maria would have made sure there would be a culinary feast of various native delicacies, desserts, and drinks for all of us. For this food is part of Pagdiriwang. So to welcome us this afternoon, let us hear Ms. Karina Bolasco, Director of the Ateneo University Press.
Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue, would not be possible without Joycie Dorado Alegre's keen and intelligent appreciation of her late husband's work. It is not out of a widow's dutiful homage to an intellectual partner, but it is in fact an equal's fine valuation of his lifetime work and its considerable influence on a nation's becoming. It is from knowing that 24 notebooks of field data by a sensitive and reflexive researcher cannot and must not go to waste, but instead nourish to grow organically. Joycie herself, after years of working on this book, is infinitely more knowledgeable and far the wiser for her own work in cultural education. Ed Alegre, after 11 months of sabbatical in the United States, knew the work to be done was at home. His encounters with Kagi Sahara, an Iranu Maguindanao Malong weaver from Cotabato City, and the Kirentekan Manobo of North Cotabato, instructed him in the ways of true field research. I quote, to dig in deep, keep going back, get involved in their lives, close quotes. So he did, from an individual to an entire village, and continued to see them not as sources or subjects, but as places of warmth, as sustenance in travel that goes on and on. Biyahe and travelogue are therefore signifiers for the meaningful, rich research. The shape the book is in, we credit to the editor Ricky de Ungria's resolve to intersperse the essays with actual field notes. Ricky, who migrated to Davao in 1999, and I think eventually from poetry to prose, noted that, and I quote, Ed was probably the only one in his time who was doing such critical reflexive meditations that could be useful for present and future researchers, close quotes. With this stimulating mix of thinking, as it streamed, and as processed based on what Eddie saw, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched, the book shows the dynamic between theory and research. To see what everybody else has perhaps seen, yet think what nobody else has thought. This book therefore documents an active, curious mind at work, and Ricky calls it virtually a kind of intellectual biography. Edilberto Alegre sums up truthfully, and maybe for some provocatively, and I quote, by going south, I went north. I gradually found our national culture. It was like going back to what we had forgotten in Luzon and even in the Visayas. With this travelogue, I end the division of our archipelago into distinct regions that have become shamefully superficial and utterly senseless. Not differences, but similarities. Not for meaning solely, but for enrichment, for the surprise of recognitions. I am wherever I go. Close quotes. Today's conversations will run along these themes in the many aspects of our culture that travel naturally involves. So that's language, food, faith, rituals, and festivals. Welcome all to this conversation.
Thank you, Karina. And now, Dr. Prospero Covar, who is the Philippine Studies Guru of UP Diliman, who guided Ed Alegre to take the road less traveled. In writing this book, will give a message. Dr. Prospero Covar of UP Diliman is considered a maverick academician and founding pillar on Philippine studies, and has mentored generation upon generation of MA and PhD graduates, including author Ed Alegre. He started the pioneering work on Philippine Culture Index, requested by the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. He is a multi-awarded anthropologist and outstanding international alumnus of the University of Arizona. He has been recognized and awarded by the Gawad Psikolohiyang Pilipino, the Gawad Balagtas ng Unyong mga Manunulat ng Pilipinas, and honorary of the National Historical Institute, and many other institutions. So let us welcome Professor and Dr. Prospero Covar.
Magandang araw po sa ating lahat. Di matatawaran ang kahalagahan ng fieldwork sa pag-aaral ng kulturang Pilipino, sa pagsisiyasat ng kanyang galaw at kaisipan sa antas na pang-individual at ng salipunan na kanyang ginagalawan. Ito ay nangangailangan ng disiplina mula sa pagkalap ng datos, sa pagtala nito at hanggang sa pamaraan kung paano ito maihatid o mailalathala. Ang pagkalap ng datos ay kalimitang ginagawa sa pamamagitan ng di lang sa pagmamasid at pagpapanayam, kundi sa pakipag-ugnayan at pakipamuhay sa lugar na sinasakupan. Ang pagkilos na ito ay nangangailangan ng bukas na pag-isip at ng ibayong pakiramdam o kung tawagin natin sensitivity sa Ingles. Kalimitan ang isang mananaliksik ay nagpupunta sa isang lugar na siya niyang pinag-aaralan upang tiyakin, patunayan o pagtibayin na ang kanyang nauna ng teorya o mga palagay batay sa kanyang sariling kaalaman at karanasan. Ngunit sumalamang sa hindi, ang tunay na mananaliksik ay makakakuha ng higit sa kanyang inaasahan. Yan ang kanyang kaligayahan. Di ba nga't ang ibig sabihin ng Alegre ay kasiyahan? Ito marahil ang nag-udyok kay Ed sa kanyang mga fieldwork, ang kaligayahan na makadiskubre ng ibang kaalaman na kanya nang pinagbubulay-bulayan. Kaya sa ating mga pag-uusap at diskusyon, kanyang pinagdidesisyonan na pumunta ng Mindanao upang mapagtanto at linangin ang gumagalaw na sa kanyang saganang kaisipan. Na kanyang naisulat ang kanyang mga nadiskubre at mga napag-alaman ay isang regalo sa ating lahat. Sa ating pagbabasa, makikita natin kung sino ang ano ang proseso ng pag-iisip ni Ed ng kanyang itong isulat. At dahil ito ay naisulat sa ganang distinctively Ed, tila may nadidinig mo ang kanyang tinig sa bawat pahina. Hindi lingid sa ating kaalaman na ang ating kultura ay nagpabago-bago sa pag-usad ng panahon. Kaya nga mahalaga na may mga nailimbag na ganitong kasulatan na naglalathala ng mga kondisyon ng pamumuhay sa panahon ito ay naisulat. Ang mga napagtanto ni Ed sa kanyang paglalakbay ay magiging gabay sa susunod ng mga henerasyon na magnanais na magsiyasat kung ng katulad nito. Di nga ba't nakikita na natin ng interes ang kanyang anak na si Lakan sa gawaing ito. Ako kasama ng aking pamilya ay nagagalak sa patuloy naming ugnayan kay Joycie at Lakan. Pinabati namin sila at ang kanyang buong kapunan sa paglalathala ng aklat na ito. Iba yung pag-iingat po sa ating lahat, sa ating paglalakbay. Maraming salamat po.
Dr. Prospero Covar. And now, from the Kirinteken Menuvo of Bentangan, a group befriended by the author, let us listen to a folk song called Delinday by Mrs. Lydia Anlubos Pobre. And this will be followed by a dance performance of the Kirinteken Menuvo of Bentangan. Lydia Anlubos Pobre is an Eremano ne Menuvo Kirinteken of Bentangan, Carmen, North Cotabato. After completing her elementary education at Gawasan Elementary School in Bentangan and her secondary education at Kitubao High School in Alameda, North Cotabato, she served as a teacher in their community, teaching young and old how to read and write. She is also a farmer and a dancer. Currently, she is a novice practitioner of Ulahingan chanting and is one of the chanters in the community weekend gathering. She assisted Ed Alegre in organizing the Bentangan Basic Literacy and Reforestation Training projects. Alegre wrote her story titled A Manobo Woman Asserts Herself in this book, Biyaheng Pinoy. So now let us listen to the song of Lydia Anlubos Pobre, which will be followed by a dance performance of the Kirinteken Menuvo of Bentangan. Let's welcome Lydia.
Before, after, matanda na ako. 1993 pa lang, nakita kami ni Sir Ed at saka si Ma'am Joycie. Ngayon, ilang taon na, 24 na ang anak ko na si Balasang. Kaya maraming salamat sa libro na pinadala nyo sa amin. Ay kutar kakle mo kon ko so palimbawad toon ay dagalan ka po salamat dot lango na ngataw dut lusod arat bintangan tawara dod mo lepate dot asawa ni midsing tao kus lusod arat bintangan so homtaane no ando na napangiling iling doy kas pinandayan ni midsing tao dot losod arat bintangan nadakalan kab pasolamat dot losod arat bintangan. Si Sir Ed po ay masasabi naming pinakamabait na tao sa amin sa Bintangan. Si Ma'am Joycie, kasi marami silang naitulong sa amin noong 1993 hanggang 1997. Nagbigay po sila ng bigas na 200 sacks at saka nagdala po sila ng mga doktor doon sa Bintangan. Si Ma'am Sosi Mercado po ang naalaala kong doktor noon. Kaya maraming salamat po sa inyo, ma'am. Hanggang sa nakapunta pa ako ng Maynila, doon ako nakatira sa bahay nila. Nakatrabaho ako, tinulungan din ako ni Sir Ed. Kaya maraming salamat. Hindi ko talaga makalimutan ang tulong ninyo sa akin noong dalaga pa ako. Kaya maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Sa iyo, ma'am, si Lakan, at sa lahat na tumutulong sa librong ito. Maraming salamat.
Boss Pobre, who has now 4 children, and to the Kirintekan Menuvo of Bentangan. Thank you so much. We have invited 4 expert speakers who will give their different perspectives on Edilberto Alegre's book, Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue. Each will be given a few minutes, after which there will be an interactive discussion among them. So meantime, while our audience is listening to them, they can prepare questions, which they can post in the Facebook and YouTube page of theirs. So just identify yourself so we can guide you in asking the questions to the right speaker. Now to our speakers, our first speaker is Brother Carl Gaspar, who wrote the foreword of Biyaheng Pinoy. He is a Redemptorist brother, anthropologist, lecturer, writer, artist, and peace builder. He finished AB Sociology at Ateneo de Davao University, MS Economics at Asian Social Institute, and PhD in Philippine Studies in UP Diliman. He was also granted a PhD Humanities Honoris Causa by Xavier University. Currently, he is teaching at St. Alfonso's Theological and Mission Institute in Davao City. Let us welcome Brother Carl Gaspar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alice. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Good. So good afternoon, everyone. I am very honored to be part of this online event, and I thank Joycie for inviting me, not just to this event, but for also writing the foreword of this fabulous book, Biyaheng Pinoy, by Ed Alegre. As soon as I had the manuscript, I was very curious, of course, and very interested to immediately read the various essays in this collection. I am 73 years old. I was born in Davao City in 1947. My father is from Capiz, who grew up in Iloilo, and migrated here just before the war. My mother is from Pangasinan, grew up in Tondo, Manila, and migrated here in Davao also just before the war. Both of them naturally traveled across the islands to reach what is so-called the land of promise, hoping that they would have a better future when they arrived in this island. Early on, my father, who was working with logging companies, brought us across various parts of Mindanao, especially Lanao and Cotabato, where logging concessions were already operating. So in my youth, I have been already traveling across Mindanao. After college, I then took on jobs that brought me all over Mindanao. And I can say that in the last 50 years of my life, I have been to the various corners of southern Philippines. Name it, and I would have been there for various reasons, including the work that I did in various NGOs and faith-based institutions, my field work when I was doing my studies, and in the last 30 years as a missionary under the Redemptorists because we travel across Mindanao. So certainly I am very familiar with the many places that Ed traveled across the years that he spent around the various places in Mindanao that then became the reason for his interest in Mindanao, including writing a travelogue or writing pieces that eventually was compiled into this travelogue. I was really fascinated by the manner that somebody like him would have viewed this place, because I would have viewed this place as a native, as having grown here and having familiarized myself with the many Moro and Lumad cultures that I have been interacting in the last 50 years. And this is, of course, the reality of a native person who is from that particular homeland. There are so many things that he takes for granted because since childhood, these were sort of everyday experiences. I was very lucky growing up in Digos, Davao del Sur, where I did my early years until I finished high school. Because that town was a microcosm of Mindanao. Nearby were mountain villages of the Bagubo Tagabawa, and they would come down to the poblacion every weekend to be at the market. And therefore, I was already quite familiar with who they were. Right across our neighborhood was a village of Huluanons, people from Hulo who had migrated to Davao, this before even the troubles erupted during martial law. So I was growing up already quite familiar with the cultures of the Bagubo Tagabawa, the people from Hulo, and of course the various ethnicities of migrant families. And through the years, especially because of my work and my travel and my field work, these are areas that have become very familiar. And of course, as he writes in his book, came only to discover Mindanao much later in his life, growing up primarily in Luzon. And naturally, one can understand how struck he was with what he experienced and what he saw, especially if these were not familiar in terms of his own personal experiences. And indeed, as I became more interested in anthropology, I did field work, and taught anthropology for a number of years until I retired last year from Ateneo de Davao University. The field of anthropology has provided me a new way of understanding and appreciating the various cultures of Mindanao. And certainly, like Ed, I am also very sad that whenever I go to the Visayas, especially Luzon and especially Manila, that you get alienated by what would have become already a much more westernized culture, although there are residue and remnants of what would be the indigenous, which are still very much alive among the Moro and Lumad peoples in Mindanao. Nonetheless, these have been very much corrupted. And I can understand that those who do enter into a deeper appreciation of Filipino cultures would really find Mindanao quite fascinating. And as with the experience of Ed Alegre, he would really write about it, expressing very much this deep appreciation. The essay that really struck me most in this book is the one going towards the end of the book, which is our killing of our ancient culture. I was almost in tears after I read that essay. And I was so struck by it that when I wrote the foreword, I knew that I would end my foreword quoting parts of that essay. Because this has been also my realization. Macario Chu, one of our local historians here in Mindanao, is a good friend of mine, is currently still with the Ateneo de Davao University and has written some history books centered on Mindanao and Davao. Consider the colonization that happened, that began 500 years ago. And this year, of course, we're commemorating this particular, the beginning of this particular epoch. He would claim that the colonization that began and has prospered across the Spanish to the American period has beheaded us as a people, so that you can almost think of a metaphor of headless chickens sort of jumping all over the place and lost and almost dying. To be beheaded, I think, is a very appropriate metaphor, because when we were colonized and something died or something was taken away from our ancestors, we lost. We lost something that really provided a very clear identity of who we were. And yet, fortunately, that whole sweeping colonization, while it did affect very much the peoples of the Visayas and Luzon, did not penetrate areas in the Cordillera, areas in Palawan, parts of Sierra Madre, and especially Mindanao. And that's why in these places where we have indigenous peoples and where the Moro people still hold on to their indigenous cultures, but which of course right now is very much affected by the Arabization of Islam. These are the manifestations of the rich indigenous cultures that we had long before the colonizers beheaded us. So indeed, ancient cultures in this country were murdered, were killed, as Ed Alegre wrote in this essay, and that has created some kind of a tragic situation for us. I was reading the book of Ed Alegre at the end of a 6-month period when I was writing a book, which began with the pandemic and which I intended for this year. And that book is going to be published by Clarice Communications early March. I entitled it Remembrance. I even used the word Cebuano word, Handumanan, or Handumanan Remembrance, digging for our indigenous wellspring. And I think the book is of the same wavelength as this essay of Ed Alegre. By tapping into the fields of history, anthropology, sociology, and theology, I revisited this whole period of the Spanish regime, and especially looking into the whole demonization of our indigenous belief system, that which created the tragedy of who we are. Because very much the music, the dance, the cultures, the way we had our festivals, our festivities, the kinship system, the rituals, everything that constituted who we were and still are as a people revolve around the richness of that indigenous belief system and the spirituality that ungirded it. And when that got demonized, including the harassment, the persecution, maybe even the killing of their babaylans, the shamans that held sort of the richness of all of this. That process of demonization ultimately affected the Filipino soul. Anyway, so that's all really I wanted to say. And it's very interesting that I was reading through the dates of Ed Alegre's travels, and he did this, of course, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, towards even the time when he was not well, perhaps, and led to his passing. This was around the time that I was also traveling all over Mindanao because of both field work and also my work as a Redemptorist missionary. And somehow, well, of course, Mindanao is so huge and wide, that if you don't know a person ahead of time, the chances are you will never encounter each other. Although I would like to imagine that at some bus terminal, at some airport, at some point where travelers converge, we might have been there. But since I didn't know him, I didn't recognize him. But right now, with the book, I could almost imagine that we were bumping into each other. And the final word is this, that Ed has passed away, but this is the
I think the signal of Brother Carl is bad. Okay, shall we continue? Thank you, Brother Carl Gaspar. Thank you so much for your sharing. Our second speaker, Miss Felice Santa Maria, has been a pioneering writer and veteran culinary historian and cultural heritage advocate for over 4 decades. She is into the history, sociology, anthropology, and literature of our food culture. Her book, Governor General's Kitchen, Culinary Vignettes and Period Recipes from 1521 to 1935, won in the International Gourmand World Cookbook Award for Food History category, a very outstanding award. Her other culinary books have also won awards here in our country. Felice has been officer of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the UNESCO National Commission of the Philippines, the National Museum, and the Ayala Museum. Let's welcome Ms. Felice Santa Maria.
There, thank you so much, Peanuts. I remember when you
Felice?
used to go around for MCCA. So I'm
Yes.
here. Hi, everybody. I'm here as a fan of Ed Alegre. Um, I just like to very quickly bring us back to I first met Ed in 1979. I know that we have a very big Ateneo audience, and it was the literature professor, Doreen Fernandez. She was teaching at Ateneo at the time, and Doreen was the first to organize the first ever conference on food as culture here in the Philippines. That was in 1979. So for the first day, Doreen spoke, and then she asked me to talk about the colonial elements of Philippine cuisine. On the second session, second day, Doreen spoke. She invited Nancy Reyes Lumen, to speak about street food and popular food culture. And that event, the last event, culminated with the launching of a book called Sarap. And Sarap was authored by Doreen and Edilberto Alegre. So that's when I met Ed. We were so much younger then. And we went our separate ways. And I never saw Ed until many, many years after. I became very enamored with Ed's writing. So to me, Ed was the man behind a Business World column called Pinoy na Pinoy. I missed all these other columns because of my work. And thankfully, my husband would bring home the Business World after work. And after I came home, usually quite tired also from cultural management work, it was such a relief to read Ed Alegre's column. One was brought not just into Mindanao, one was brought into all these different places in the Philippines where at the time I couldn't go. He was there with the folk, he was there with the grassroots. And he was using an anthropologist and a sociologist's framework of understanding the encounters that he had. And then somewhere along the way, Ed said he had gotten married and that he was going to be a father. And then he would write a little bit about what it was like to see his little boy start to walk, fall, and stand up again. So after a while, you sort of develop a friendship with a writer. And for those of you out there who think that maybe somewhere in your future you are going to be writing, Ed is an example of what happens. He keeps writing, I keep reading, and I have an image of Ed Alegre. Now, sometimes when you meet these people who you've been reading, when you meet them in real life, you say, oh my gosh, I wish I had never met them. I wish they had just stayed as an image, you know. But in the case of Ed, I don't know how it happened, but it was in the 90s, probably in the early to mid 90s. I happened to be speaking in Cebu, and somehow Ed and I got together. We spent the whole afternoon chatting about food and our interests. Remember, we hadn't seen each other since 1979, and we hardly got to talk in 1979. So I'm talking like maybe 20 years later. And Ed says, come on, I have this friend. Why don't the three of us continue? And we'll have dinner at Eddie's log cabin in Cebu, which is right near the, it's right in the Camboan area, right? Where the Bagsakan is. And so we went on, and heaven only knows what time we finished. Probably they had to kick us out of the restaurant. And that was the last time I saw Ed. So my relationship with Ed is really through what he wrote. And this book, the Biyaheng Pinoy, to me is very important reading. For one thing, Ed says, it is important to begin in the wilderness. When he says that, you know, we are trained in school to have academic frameworks and to use them in various disciplinal frameworks to better understand the topic we are researching. But I think Ed is very practical. And what he's also saying is keep all your senses alert, because as you do your field work, in his case, you might miss something important. You might not sense it because you're too focused on a particular research framework. So that was one take on the book that I thought was very important. That, as Ed said, in the field, I didn't make a hypothesis, not while gathering data, because he allowed the data, once you have all this data, he allowed the data to speak to him and the data to show him where the data was interconnected. So I think that's very important for those of you who are in school. You read this book and you realize Ed's advice makes good sense. The second take on the book brings Ed and myself very closer to shared research. Ed was using cuisine as a metaphor for culture. So sometimes in the microcosm of cuisine, one can sense the macrocosm that is Philippine culture. And for Ed, it was very important that he look into different words. And these words, how the words were handled, was one way of showing the strength of the Filipino. I know that he wrote, I wanted to find out what food told us about our culture. And one way for him to find out what food would tell us about was his search for the words of what he considered outstanding local dishes. Real quickly, I'd like to mention one in particular that he talks about. It's called lawot lawot, and he found it in Palo Leyte. And what it is layers of vegetables, greens and gabi roots and coconut milk. And the beauty of all of this is that the last layer of lawot lawot is the richest coconut cream, to which is added sanggig, which is a sweet basil, and it has a very, very subtle, a very subtle elegance to it. And for Ed, this lawot lawot was an expression of what he called a local outstanding food. The elements of a local outstanding dish for him was not only flavor, but things like it utilized only the ingredients nearby. In other words, nothing was imported from even the next town. Everything was immediately accessible. Secondly, the dish was highly affordable. And thirdly, everybody knew about it. It was so popular. It was a dish that everyone in the community could eat, and that everybody in the community recognized. So for him, this was important. This is where you see food uniting a community. For me, it was very important to add lawot lawot to my list of vegetable dishes because I've been studying vanishing vegetables. And my earliest historical evidence for our use of coconut milk with vegetables, for cooking vegetables in coconut milk, is from 1624. That's the earliest I've found, from Francisco San Antonio, a missionary whose dictionary came out in 1624, and which was translated and published by, or rather just published by Ateneo de Manila. So to Ed, it was also important to catch these local words, because that's it. The local word, the local dish, meant that it was a unifying factor, culturally a unifying factor. And it also showed how well a community understood its environment, understood how to make use of the natural ingredients nearby. The third point that I consider extremely important in this book is what I call purposeful similarities. So it is important that we look at what is common. In fact, Ed says our nationhood is in our similarities. And so for Ed, his beginning point was Lumad culture. And he in the book explains that some of the Lumads became Muslim and some of the Lumads became Christian. And I think this is where Ed and I are truly soulmates. You see, I sincerely believe that it is time for each one of us to find within ourselves our Lumadness. For instance, how do I find my Lumadness? Every time I look up at the sky at night and I see the Ursa Major, the Big Bear constellation, I relate to my Tagalog tribal Lumadness. My father is Tagalog. And you see, to me, that constellation isn't the Big Bear. We don't have bears in the Philippines. It would have been impossible for us to call it Ursa Major. So what did my Tagalog ancestry, what did my Tagalog Lumad ancestry see in the sky? That constellation they called Daung-Daungan. The Daung, the old definition of Daung is a boat. If you look it up today, it will say a pier. But if you go into the earlier dictionaries, such as the kind of work that I do, you will see that Daung-Daungan is a huge boat. It is a mysterious, magical boat that is up there in the sky. And it brings us to fantastic places. It is the imagination of the mind. And to me, this is significant because then I can understand the Lumadness in my culture. But it means my looking for it. Because, for instance, if you talk to many scientists and you go to the observatories, they're not going to tell you about the prehistoric names for stars. You're not going to be told the prehistoric names or the pre-colonial names for winds and waters and currents. No. So you have to, on your own, search for your own IPhood. I had the good fortune of being in one of the highland IP communities. We helicoptered from Davao in the 70s into a highland area, and the person who headed our delegation gave the title, pardon me, my dog's in the room, the title of the ancestral lands, excuse me, Merlin, be quiet, gave the title of the ancestral lands to this IP community. And they didn't know how to say thank you for such a wonderful gift. So what did they do? I couldn't believe it. They brought us into this building, a little wooden building. I shouldn't say little because it was quite large. And they laid maybe 4 tables end to end and another 4 tables end to end. And what was on the tables? They were topped by freshly picked durian. Every single durian was at its perfect ripeness. This was their way of saying thank you for this wonderful gift. And I had the privilege of being there, of enjoying the durian. And I've had other experiences in IP communities before they became tourist attractions. So you got to feel this ancientness that we are part of, if, like Ed, we are willing to look for it, understand it, and acquire the affection for it. We can be multicultural, why not? My father's Tagalog, my mother is Ilongga. Put that all together, what am I? I'm a Manila girl. So we are multicultural in many ways. And I'd like to end this by sharing a eureka moment. And this eureka moment was so precious to me. I'd been researching words in Spanish colonial dictionaries for years, and I don't know why I didn't have the eureka moment earlier. See, because I wasn't thinking of working in the wilderness. I wasn't really thinking of just being totally open and letting the research speak to me. And then one day I said, oh my heavens, I suddenly realized. And what happens when you're passionate about a sudden realization? You want to share it with somebody. That's the first thing you want to do. It's our social self saying, I want to share it with somebody. I had nobody to share it with because the only person I could think of who would have understood it was Ed Alegre. So Joycie, I'm sharing this with you. I'm sharing it with our audience. What was that eureka moment that I wanted to share with Ed? And I've written a paper about this. It was published by Budhi and Ateneo. I came to the realization through my studies of colonial period dictionaries and word lists and travelogues and all of that, that we feed the physical hunger. That is our kalusugan. We feed our spiritual hunger. And there's a whole set of facts that you have to put together to show that we fed our spiritual self through kaginhawaan. And this kaginhawaan, this feeding the spirit, was not only something that the Catholic missionaries understood, but it's something that they were able to track back to our paganism. So we have been feeding our spirituality with kaginhawaan. And here's the eureka moment. We also feed our social self. Now we all know Filipinos really have this very high interpersonal intelligence as a society. We love people. We like to be with people. We want to eat with people. Now, I discovered a word in Father Encarnacion's dictionary of the 1860s. It's a Cebuano word that was also used in Bohol and in northern Mindanao, where the Visayas had also settled. And the word is naya, 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 naya. It means firstly to serve other people, to cook for other people, to feed other people, okay, to take care of other people. The second meaning is to be a happy person. So you put them together and you realize that naya naya is a recipe for happiness. We become happy when we feed other people, when we serve other people. Then we become happy. Now, the word naya naya in that meaning is somewhat archaic now. It's disappearing. Some people remember their grandmothers still using the word. What has survived is naya nayaon. It is the adjective of naya naya. And naya nayaon today is associated with being calm. Okay, being calm. But in the 1860s, naya nayaon meant that you had become affable, you had become kind and happy, you had therefore become ready to be benign, ready to calm yourself, and ready to relate with the world with this sense of harmony. So we, the Filipinos, we feed our personal physical hunger, our societal physical hunger, we feed our spiritual hunger, and we feed our social self. And so that's what I would have indeed shared with Ed. And I thank Ed for his research. I thank Ed for his thinking, and I thank Ed for his inspiration.
Thank you so much, Felice. I'm sad that we cannot have Dr. Prospero Covar because he has the word for your lumadness. He calls it katutubo. You know,
Yes.
he taught that to us, katutubo. Yes, and that is the katutubo perspective that he taught us, you know. So I love your word, lumadness. Okay, but sadly he's not with us. It was a tape message that he gave. Thank you so much. Now, for our third speaker, we have Professor Mary Jane Rodriguez Tatel, who is Assistant Professor at the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature, College of Arts and Letters at UP Diliman, where she teaches Philippine Studies and Filipino language courses. She has a Bachelor of Arts and Masters in History from UP Diliman, and she has just completed her doctoral dissertation in Philippine Studies on, quote, non-Moro indigenous peoples of Mindanao. That's so interesting. In the context of the Bangsamoro Organic Law and the Bangsamoro Basic Law. Her other research interests include women, ethnicity, politics of language, and knowledge production. Let's welcome Professor Mary Jane Rodriguez Tatel.
Ngayong hapon sa lahat, mupiyang maapon, sabi nga ng mga manobo, ng mga kaibigan nating manobo. Pinamagatan ko yung aking munting inihandang reflection na si Med Singataw, ang bantay patungo sa kaibuturan ng Kapilipinuhan. Itong pangalang ito, Med Singataw, ay yung pangalan na ibinigay o ibininyag ng mga karantekan manobo ng bentangan kay Edilberto Alegre sa ating pinagpupugayan ngayong hapon. At nais kong dito magsimula sa domainang personal, ang loob o kaibuturan ng may akda bilang si Med Singataw. Actually, hindi lang ito personal, kundi spiritual din. Dahil ang Singataw ay nangangahulugan din ng parang apparition o yung counterpart ng apparition. Halimbawa ni nagpakita si Archangel Gabriel kay Virgin Mary, no? So isang pag-uusap ng o nagpakitang espiritu, banal na espiritu sa isang pious na tao. So sa ganang spiritual domain na ito, no? Bininyagan siya bilang at ang ibig sabihin ng Singataw sa kanila ay unexpected blessings. Sa mga arumanan manubo ng nasabing lugar, nag-anyo siya, nag-transform siya bilang isang daan, bridge, sabi nga niya, no? Saring kaparaanan, means, at higit sa lahat, isang instrumento. Muli, umaalingaw pa sa isipan ko ang sinabi niyang ito. And I quote, I have been reborn to our racial past. Bentangan is my way to becoming. End of quote. Sa antas personal, nanuot at tumama ito sa aking kaibuturan. Hindi ko man siya kilalang personally. Pero, gaya rin ni Sir Ed, ako rin ay layas at mahilig maglakbay. Napunta ako ng Baguio ng aking first year of teaching sa UP. Naging familiar din ako sa terrain at sa mga lugar na binabanggit niya, sa Sagada, sa Besao, at sa iba't ibang lugar sa Ilocandilla. At isa rin po ang bentangan sa aking napuntahan sa panahon ng aking pananaliksik para nga dito sa aking disertasyon tungkol sa mga non-Moro indigenous peoples. Ika nga nila. Ang non-Moro indigenous peoples, ang bagong kategorya na ipinakilala ng nooy panukalang batas na BBL para sa mga lumadana sa core territory at adjacent territory ng binubuong bagong Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. Sa kategoryang ito, NMIP, sabi nga nila, isa ang mga arumanen o erumanen ni Manubo sa nakapaloob sa sinasabing adjacent territory. Makikita niyo po sa mapa yung kinalalagyan nila. Ito po yon. So itong mga nasa green areas, green colored areas, ito yung tinatawag nating mga lumad sa core territory. Ang adjacent o sabi nga nila kanubnog no, nasa kagiliran, ay napaka-strategic kasi ito na yung sinasabing lugar ng expansion. Gaya ng mga Teduray, Blaan, Haghigaonan, isa rin sila sa tumututol sa bagong ini-impose sa kanilang nomenclature, Bangsamoro. Sapagkat sabi nila, May sarili kaming pangalan, may sarili kaming pagkatao. Lubhang personal, lubhang emosyonal ang usapin ng katawagan, sapagkat usapin din ito ng rekurso, ng resources, ng lupa, ng kabuhayan at ng kanilang buhay. Isa na lamang ang bentangan ngayon sa nalalabing bahagi ng dati-rati napakalawak, lubhang malawak na lupaing ninuno ng mga Arumanen. Tama ang may akda. Sabi niya, doubly victimized sila. Hindi lang sila minorya, tinagurian din silang minorya sa loob ng minorya, minority within the minority. Sa madaling sabi, may dalawa pang sapin mula sa itaas pa ibaba. At sa tindi ng pagkalugar nila sa ibaba, gayon na lamang kalalim ang kanilang kinaroroonan. Hindi lang sila biktima ng kapabayaan ng gobyerno, ng mga negosyo ng trusuhan at plantasyon at ng serye ng mga migrasyon ng mga settler na Ilonggo at Cebuano. Ang pakay din naman ay kabuhayan nung pumunta sila ng Mindanao. Ngayon, target din sila umano ng ekspansyon, quote-unquote, ng Bangsamoro o ng mga Muslim na sa totoo lang ay itinuring na rin nilang suled o kapatid, kapwa nila katutubo, kapwa nila minorya. Nagkukrus ang mga landas ng lahat ng puwersang ito at ngayon lumilikha ng mas matinding kalbaryo ng kawalan at pagkasira ng lupa, kahirapan at banta sa identidad sa ngalan ng mainstream development. Lahat ng ito dahil sa kanilang holistikong pananaw sa daigdig. Sabi nila kasi, ang lupa ang aming sarili. Ang lupa ay kaloob ni magbabaya. Sagrado ang lupa, sagrado ang aming pagkamanobo. Kaya dito lang kami. So mientras, sabi nga ni Sir Ed, ginagahasa o nire-rape ang lupaing ninuno, nire-rape din ang kanilang lipi. Malalim, napakalalim ang pagkakaugat nila sa inang kalikasan sa lupang tinubuan. Pananaw ito na sumasaliwa sa agos ng merkado, ng progresong nakatuon lang sa kapangyarihan ng tao at ng gobyernong binabalangkas nito. Itong dahilan kung bakit napagtanto ni Sir Ed, and I quote, "Bentangan's loss is our loss." End of quote. Subalit ang kanya rin namang kaligtasan ay ang ating ding kaligtasan. At sa pagiging bidsing na tao, isang pag-asa ang kanyang idinudulog sa atin. Mula sa mga muni-muni at realisasyon ng pakikipag-ugnayan sa mga taga-Bentangan at sa iba pang nasa laylayan na kanilang kinakatawan, nakabuo siya ng isang paradigm sa pagtuklas o pagpapayaman ng ating kaalaman. Ang payo nga niya sa atin, dig deep, keep going back, get involved in their lives. Lumubog, pumailalim, magpabalik-balik sa pinagmulan. Pakisangkot at makibahagi sa kanilang buhay. Narinig siguro natin kanina, no? Sa patotoo ni Lydia Pobre, kung gaano siya naging bahagi ng kanilang buhay, kasama ang kanyang kabiyak na si Ma'am Joycie. Mahalaga ang nasa ibaba, ang base matrix, ika nga niya, sapagkat nakaugat, may kapangyarihan itong ukilkilin at yanigin ang kairalan upang magsilang ng pagbabago sa ating pagkaunawa sa lipunan. Sa katutubong epistemolohiya, ang lupa ay lupaing ninuno. Take note, hindi lang ito simpleng lupa. Ito ay ninuno rin. Pinag-uugnay ang lupa, ang espasyong pisikal, ang materya, at ang ninuno ang gunita. Sa terminong tana pusaka or pusaka inged, isa itong pamana. Ang pusaka ay pamana, no? sa mga lumad na ito. Pamanang lumilikha ito ng dialogo sa pagitan ng nakaraan, kasalukuyan at hinaharap. Iniuugnay at pinag-uugnay-ugnay tayo sa isang daloy. Muli, ang tinig ni Sir Ed, and I quote, "The lumad is the constant that connects the three groups in our country, the lumad, the Muslim, and the Christian. He is the substance of that adjective, Filipino." End of quote. Sa sinabi niyang ito, pinalalawig niya ang transformative na bisa ng Bentangan mula sa antas personal, lokal, tungong antas nasyonal. At nadama ko rin ang transformatibong bisang ito ng Bentangan. Kung makikita niyo po yung mapa kanina, pwedeng pakibalikan natin. Nabanggit doon ni Sir Ed, no? Galing sila sa tinatawag na sinimburan o sa bangke sinimburan sa kanilang alamat. Ang sinimburan, ibig sabihin ng sinimburan, sinimbur, pagsasama-sama. So makikita natin, yung estratehikong posisyon ng mga Eromanen sa gitnang Mindanao. Nasa lugar sila ng tagpuan o sabi nga nila salapungan o serpungan ng mga ilog, sapa, no? Yung ilog Pulangi, ito yung Rio Grande de Mindanao, ito yung pinakamalaking river network, no? Na siyang nag-uugnay-ugnay sa iba't ibang terrain, anyo ng kalupaan dito. Subalit hindi lamang kalupaan ang pinag-uugnay-ugnay ng ilog na ito, pati ang buhay ng mga taong nagbuo ng komunidad dito. So sa pagkapagitnaan na ito, no, sa sinasabi nilang pusad tetana or navel of the earth, no, gumaganap sila ng isang mahalagang papel bilang hugpungan o salapungan. So sa salapungan na ito ng mga tao, makikita rin natin ang bisa nila o ang importansya nila sa pagbubuo natin ng kabansaan. At dito nga sinasabi ni Sir Ed na nagmumula ang ating kabansaan sa bentangan. Isa itong talinhaga, isa itong metapora. Kung tutuusin, dako tayo doon sa diagram ng pagsulong ng Philippine Studies. Kung tutuusin, nagsimula na sa henerasyon ng mga ilustrado ang pagpapatampok sa mga katutubo bilang integral at fundamental sa proyekto ng pagsasabansa. At sa kontekstong ito, isinilang ang Araling Pilipino o Philippine Studies. Isinama ni Rizal ang seksyong Razas Independientes na tumutukoy sa mga tribus independientes sa nooy plano niyang buuing Asociación Internacional de Filipinas noon sa Pransya noong 1889. Brother of the Wild naman ang itinaguri kay Isabelo Don Belong de los Reyes sa kanyang labis na pagkilala at pagpapahalaga sa mga tinggian ng Abra. At mula sa yaman ng mga katutubong tradisyon, ilalatag niya ang pundasyon ng kanyang El Folklore Filipino. Tinawag niya itong archibo ng totalidad ng gunita at alaala ng mga komunidad. Kinilara rin niya ang El Folklore bilang importanteng papel o kinalala rin niya rito sa El Folklore ang napaka-importanting papel ng mga katutubo, hindi lamang bilang paksa, kundi bilang scientist at scholar. Para sa kanya, samot-saring inventaryo ang El Folklore ng, quote, pre-modern o pre-moderno, nativo, moderno o postmoderno. Ika nga, isang dinamiko at sinkretikong proseso ng pagsulong at melikhaing pag-aangkop ng katutubong kalinangan sa harap ng mga pagbabago. Hindi lamang ito para sa pagsulong ng etnolohiya sa Pilipinas. Mas malaki at politikal ang agenda nito, ang pagsasabansa at pambansang identidad na nakaugat sa katutubong kalinangan. Kinilala rin ni Clemente Zulueta ang aniyay el elemento indigena or the indigenous element, which he defines as the spirit of the people that gave to his heroic character. End of quote. Pagsapit ng dekada 1970s, aarangkada ang kilusang Pilipinisasyon o indigenisasyon sa akademya. Pagsulong ito ng sinimulan ni Rizal at Don Belo tungo sa paggamit, pagbuo at pagpapayaman ng mga teorya o paradigm na nakaugat o hinango mula sa wika at kultura ng bayan. Ipakikilala ni Ver Enriquez ang dalumat ng kapwa bilang core concept ng psikolohiyang Pilipino. Gayon din ang mga direksyon ng paniniorya, yung indigenization from within and indigenization from without. Itatampok naman sa bagong kasaysayan ni Zu Salazar ang, sabi niya, pantayong pananaw sa historiografiyang mula sa loob tungo sa loob. Sa ganang pagpihit na ito, tungo sa loob, bibinyagan ni Dr. Covar ang Philippine Studies bilang Pilipinolohiya. At sa dalumat ng kaalamang bayan, ilalatag niya ang pag-unawa sa lawak, lalim at loob ng pagkataong Pilipino. Papag-aanyuin din ni Virgilio Almario ang formalismo sa panitikan upang maitanghal ang kakanyahan o uniqueness ng ating katutubong tradisyon sa kanyang bagong formalismong Pilipino. Itatanghal naman ni Ben Lumbera ang diskurso ng bayan bilang mahalagang salik sa pagharaya ng bansa sa panitikan. Subalit hindi rito natatapos ang mga punyagi. Mula sa Katagalugan o Kamaynilaan, kailangang palawigin ang diskurso, dalhin sa pinakamalalim na batayan nito, sa komunidad ni na Timuay. Ang salitang Timuay ay galing sa root word na timu, na ibig sabihin ay sa pagsamahin. No? So ang Timuay na term ng mga Arumanen para sa leader, ang ibig sabihin nito ay pagsasama. Ito ang lalim, ang base, na kung babaligtarin ay siya ring rurok o tuktok. Siyang-siya, ang metapora ng inged ng bintangan. Ang inged po yun yung bayan para sa kanila, referring to their ancestral domain. At dito nag-aambag ng husto si Sir Ed Alegre sa kanyang paglalakbay. Mula sa dakilang naratibo ng kabansaang Pilipino ng mga ilustrado noong 19th century hanggang sa mga tinagurian nating muhon or cornerstone ng kilusang Pilipinisasyon ng akademya noong 1970s. Dinadala tayo ng Biyaheng Pinoy patungo sa eskwela ng kaisipan ng komunidad. Sa napaka-personal na himig ng pagkukwento, pinadama sa atin ang bawat pihit at liko ng kanyang landas at danas. Dahil sa pagdama, hindi lamang sila field sites sa lente ng etnografiya. Ang komunidad na tinungo ni Sir Ed ay hindi lamang paksa o obheto ng pananaliksik, bagkus lunduyan, places of warmth, no? Sabi nga niya, lunduyan ng ligayang bumubukal sa kaibuturan ng sarili sapagkat sila'y nagiging kapwa o kabahagi ng sarili. Sa huli, hindi datos ang pinakamahalaga, sabi nga niya, kundi ang mga nabuong ugnayan at ang mga nagpapatuloy na pag-ugnay-ugnay at pagkakaugnay-ugnay na dinadaluyan ng kahulugan at kabuluhan. Sa malayang daloy na ito, napag-iisa ang lahat at nagiging tagapamagitan, walang nanghingibabaw. Sa katutubong epistemolohiya, wala talagang katapusan. Ang ninunong pumanaw ay sumasakabila lang upang maging espiritong papatnubay sa kanyang angkan, lalo na't sila'y naliligaw. Yumao si Apo Ed. Pero lumawig naman ang kanyang papel sa ating lipunan. Gaya ng mga ninuno, isang pusaka o pamana ang kanyang iniiwan. At gaya ng mga ninuno, nagsisilbi rin siyang ngayong ating bantay o espiritong gabay para sa mga Arumanen. Ang mga espiritong gabay ay ang ating tagapamagitan sa kabilang buhay. Patungo sa masukal at madawag na landas ng kapilipinuhan. So, tatapusin ko po ang aking pagbabahaging ito sa isang pansamantalang pagwawakas. Tebiya dot mitupa kay kena ara sihnuwa. Sa Eromanen na malubo, tabi-tabi po sa mga taga rito, sana huwag kayong sa akin ay manibago. Pansamantalang pagwawakas ang ibig sabihin ng pahimakas. Mula sa katutubong epistemolohiya, napakahalaga ng pansamantala. Dahil dito, kinikilala at binibigyang puwang ang iba pa o ang mga susunod pa. Dumadalo rin kung gayon sa pahimakas ang diwa ng pagbibigay puwang o paggalang na bumabalangkas sa pasintabi. Ang sehyuno ay karamdamang dulot ng espesyal na atensyong ibinibigay sa isang taong dayo o bago sa lugar. Sabi nung Eromanen, Weliana na kausap ko, maitutumbas ito sa bati o nabati sa atin kapag sinaktan ng tiyan at hindi alam kung anong tunay na kadahilanan. Si huno o bati, kung ano man yan, iisa lang ang ibig sabihin sa atin. May pangangailangang magpatabi-tabi po kung ikaw ay nasa bagong lugar. Pinatutuloy tayo ng Biyaheng Pinoy sa ilang o bagong lugar. Ang inged o bayan ng mga lumad. Hindi na ito bago kung tutuusin, pero nananatiling ilang o malayo sa atin sa literal at matalinhagang pananalita. Sa pagtungo sa mga ilang na lugar gaya ng Bentangan, kailangan lang po nating magpatebiya o magpatabi-tabi po, sabay usal ng winikang ito ni Apo Ed. Sabi niya, kung pagkakaisa ang hinahanap natin, commonalities ang ating tukuyin. Pinoy ka at di ka maliligaw. Napaka-positibo ng pananalitang ito. Hindi tayo maliligaw basta kilala natin ang ating sarili. So, mula po doon sa nakalulungkot na isang sanaysay na kanyang sinulat na naibahagi sa atin ni Brother Carl Gaspar, ang kung paano pinatay ang ating ancient culture. Ang bahagi pong ito, ang sanaysay pong ito na The Birth of a New Manobo, ang tugon at nagbibigay ng pag-asa sa ating lahat. Pagpupugay kay Apo Ed, saan ka man naroroon ngayon? At pagpupugay din kay Ma'am Joycie, ang Ines Kanoyan o ang kabiyak na instrumental sa muling pagbuhay kay Lamang. Marami pong salamat.
Maraming salamat, Professor Mary Jane Rodriguez Tatel. Napakayaman. Ngayon naman po ang ating fourth speaker, si Professor J. Jomar Quintos. He is an Associate Professor of Literature and Philippine Studies at the UP Diliman. His research interests are Mindanao and Sulu studies, cinema, and folklore. His critical and creative works have appeared in various national and international publications. He edited the anthology, The Invisibility of the Visible, Emancipated Mindanao and Sulu in Philippine Cinema, which was funded and published by UP Mindanao. He also co-edited the Philippine Humanities Review special issue on Mindanao and Sulu studies. Let us welcome Professor J. Jomar Quintos.
Thank you, Ms. Alice. Yes, I'll make this short. I first read Ed Alegre when I was writing my MA thesis in Philippine Studies. I needed to read the book Larangan, Seminal Essays in Philippine Culture by one of the stalwarts in the area of Philippine Studies, Dr. Prospero Covar. And then while reading the book, I realized that the one who compiled all of the essays to turn it into a book was Dr. Covar's former student, Dr. Edilberto Alegre. I became interested on who Edilberto Alegre is, so I searched for his name online, and then I found out that he has a massive contribution in the area of Philippine studies. He has written several books, such as Sarap with Doreen Fernandez, The Writers and Their Review, also with Doreen Fernandez, Inumang Pinoy, and my personal favorite, Kinilaw. And then several years later, we will have this book, Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue. For this afternoon, I prepared a short reflection about the book that undergirds the discourses on travel, language, food, vis-a-vis Philippine national cultures and identities. At first glance, one can surmise that Edilberto Alegre's Biyaheng Pinoy converses with Quirima Polot and Toveras' Adventures in a Forgotten Country, another equally compelling book. In the title essay of Toveras' work, she narrates her sojourn in Cagayan de Oro and Dipolog, which she describes as places that are spared from the virus of modernization. In Edilberto Alegre's work, Mindanao and Sulu are imagined as only heard of but unknown territories of the nation. Probably the very reason why the writer decides to embark on a journey and learn more about its cultures. The writer uses the verb travel and not adventure to describe his undertakings. While the latter is about engaging in exciting experiences and activities, the former refers to movement from one place to another, often to a place that is far away. Movement here connotes an act of process, which is active rather than passive. It is about change in terms of space, time, and character. In the words of French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the first thing we see as we travel around the world is our own filth, thrown into the face of mankind. It is in this conjuncture that I situate Edilberto Alegre's pagbiyahe, or traveling. Alegre felicitously asserts that traveling is the occasion for linguistic sojourns in the urgency for wholeness, for meanings, for totality, for insignificance. It's in page 91. He adds that traveling is a process of loading and writing about it is unloading. These two processes create a voyage of enlightenment that leads to our understanding of our national cultures. These cultures that do not always adhere to the calendrical and homogeneous time of progress and civilization. These cultures that aren't emergent, but are always there, existing and developing from the pre-colonial up to the contemporary period. These cultures that are etched in the different cultural data that one can quote from Mindanao and Sulu, such as the language, food, markets, monuments, rituals, and other performances. In Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue, there is a valuable lesson in cultural theorizing. Rely on concrete data, Edilberto Alegre said. These concrete data can be the words and syllables uttered, food consumed, seen or places observed, and a performance witnessed. Alegre opines that a researcher can sometimes go wrong with a theory, but never in concrete data that can be gathered from the field. Think, for example, of food as a cultural data. Embedded in it are various domains and stages, such as the production of ingredients to be cooked, the preparation for the cooking, and finally, the eating itself. The production of ingredients may involve farming and performance. Going and observing in the market may also be considered as part of immersing oneself in cultural data. And the eating part itself is also a cultural event. The way we adjust a foreign cuisine's taste according to one's palate, such as adding patis or fish sauce, or perhaps sugar, demonstrates indigenization, as Edilberto Alegre mentioned in his book. In all this, Edilberto Alegre's Biyaheng Pinoy is not just a travelogue, but a theoretical book that bridges the discursive and the popular. He frames and reframes, mediates and meditates, structures and restructures, constitutes and reconstitutes different ways of and pathways to seeing and reading data that reflect Philippine cultures. Culture is pluralized here as cultures to avoid essentialism and to highlight the diversity of life worlds among the different ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines. The book offers theoretical discussions that are easy to read, a feat that many from the academe aspires to do. It also tries to accommodate the gamut of Philippine studies scholars, teachers, students, readers, and even ethno-linguistic groups such as the Kirintecan Manobo of Bentangan. In Biyaheng Pinoy, the Kirintecan Manobo of North Cotabato and the Samadilaut of Sulu are imagined to embody their own cultures and nations. It aims to contribute to the congeries of discourses by situating the indigenous peoples in a critical juncture beyond perfunctory assimilation and a mere fraction of the celebrated nation. Finally, Edilberto Alegre's Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue, is a valentine to the island region of Mindanao and Sulu that continues to yearn for socio-economic justice and equality amidst the broken promises of the first Mindanaoan president of the Philippines. Thank you and good afternoon.
Professor J. I wish you had more time because each of you gave a different aspect that we would want to discuss. However, because we have no time, thank you so much for your sharing. And now we will listen to a music performance of UP An Balangao. An Balangao is a Waray phrase and it means the rainbow, whose many hues are reflected in the varied art forms and artistic talents in creating one harmonious practice and performance. This group was founded in 1984 by Professor Joycie Dorado Alegre. The UP An Balangao should be proud because it was the Chancellor's Outstanding Student Organization Awardee and the University Performing Group Awardee for 2 years in the UP Visayas. Now, this group aims to revitalize traditional performance forms of Eastern Visayas through original works like their production of Luno Handughan, which means surge of the heart, inspired by the ordeals of the Tacloban during the Super Typhoon Yolanda. The UP and Balangao has been awarded grants from the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and is celebrating its 38th year as a cultural group this 2021. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's watch UP and Balangao's performance.
Sarayaw kita, paglipaygan kita, pagrayhangan pagrisyo, isaurong kinabuhi mo. Halamano, halamana, makalikan halana, dadaan tuba, sinong mga isda. Fried chicken, hi, dali, please bring them in. Hala, hala na, hala, hala na, hala, pakaninagan. Paglinangay, pagkisumpay, pagkihimang raw, ngan paglipay. Sarayaw, sarayaw kita, paglipay kan kita, pagrayhangan pagrisyo, isaurong kinabuhi mo. Hala, hala na, hala, hala na, hala, pakaninagan. Pagrayhangan pagrisyo, isaurong kinabuhi mo. Sarayaw, sarayaw kita, paglipaygan kita, pagrayhangan pagrisyo, isaurong kinabuhi mo.
That was such a joyous performance. Thank you, UP and Balangao. And now we'll listen to Norma Alikunanan, who will speak on behalf of her aunt, the gifted Inaul weaver, Haji Sahara Samsudin, and her family, and their Irano Maguindanao community in Lugay-Lugay, Cotabato City. Ed Alegre wrote a narrative of Kagi Sahara's life in his book. And now, so we'll have our speaker, Norma Alikunanan, who holds a college degree from the Notre Dame University in Cotabato and a master's in public management from the Philippine Christian University in Manila, share with us her message. She is currently working in Manila as officer in charge of the Fiscal Control Service of the City Treasurer's Office in Manila City Hall. Welcome, Norma Alikunanan.
Magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Ako po si Norma Ali. Nagmula pa ng Lugay-Lugay, Cotabato City, isang Iranon sa Maguindanao. 1991 yung una naming nakilala si Sir Edilberto N. Alegre. Isa ito sa mga kuha niya nung nagpupunta pa sila sa Lugay-Lugay, Cotabato City. Malaki ang naitulong niya sa amin bilang isang Iranon na naipakilala niya ang aming mga gawang malong o inaul kung aming tawagin. Kahit dito sa Maynila ay natulungan niya kaming maipakilala ito. Malaki ang naitulong niya sa pag-aaral niya sa aming kultura. Katulad ng pagdiriwang namin ng Ramadan at yung mga masasarap naming luto na inahanda sa mga mahalagang okasyon ng aming buhay. Dahil sa kanya, kay Sir Ed, natulungan niya rin kami na mabuksan ang kaalaman ng iba tungkol sa kultura ng isang Muslim. Mula sa aming pamilya, lalong-lalo na sa auntie ko na namayapa na si Haji Sahara Samsudin, isa sa mga magaling gumawa ng malong sa Mindanao, ay taus-pusong nagpapasalamat kay Sir Edilberto Alegre at bumabati kami ng congratulations sa kanyang book launching na Biyaheng Pinoy, lalong-lalo na sa kanyang may bahay na si Ma'am Joycie Alegre.
Maraming salamat, Norma Ali Cunanan. I'm sad to hear that Kagi Sahara has passed away because I would have wanted to meet her after reading about her in the book of Ed Alegre. Now, if author Edilberto Alegre were with us today, he would be so proud of his son, Lacan Uhay Alegre. Lacan Uhay Alegre, who will present his poetry performance. Lacan has performed his poems for events in the Philippines and New York, USA. His poems have been published in the book Luno, Hayayan Voices and Images, in the Dagmay Literary Journal of the Davao Writers Guild, and the Katitihan Literary Journal of the Philippine South. Right now, he is completing his studies in comparative literature, major in Philippine English literature and English translation. Lacan is also a member of the UP Writers Club. So let us watch the poetry performance of the son of Edilberto Alegre, Lacan Uhay Alegre.
Things Tatay always emphasized our relationships, whether in language, food, or culture. He was unpretentious and lived by that principle because he believed that is what made us truly Pinoy na Pinoy. This poem is about our relationship and a manner of coming into terms with his passing. We never quite say goodbye, you wrote, I read from your book, years later when I finally mustered enough courage to read the words that you left. Years after I woke up to the sight of you, a dead body, gout-infected on a hospital bed here in Tacloban. That dreadful morning, Nanay held me in an embrace and sang me the lullaby you sang. You gave her your paalam. She said I was your last habilin. But you never gave me the chance to say goodbye. I remember telling you how much I hated goodbyes. How I pretended to be asleep when Kuya Elias left for the States. How I refused to kiss Tatits when we left Algo. But in that moment, I wished for your goodbye. I wanted to hear your paalam. Of the million words that you left, I do not remember the last ones you spoke to me. Until now. So I searched for them in your writings, traveling from article to article, book to book, footnote to footnote, hoping to spot even just a clue on some forsaken article. But in this search, I found the inanity of those last words because you are alive. The writer is not dead. He is alive. You speak to me. Page 119, paragraph 2, Biyaheng Pinoy. The sadness is a mode of acceptance. A manner of coming to terms with and is a response to a finality. It is the way of the heart. When you come to the end of a journey, plan the next one. Page 438, closing remarks, same book. After this page, life continues. It has been a long stopover. Thank you for being there too. Indeed, life has continued. Nan, I just released your book. Kuya Elias has a daughter, Tatet's lost a tooth. I drink now, and I have yet to finish college. I write too, just like you. I lived in Davao for a year and ate at the same carinderias you ate. Then in Diliman, where I had to reread your articles for a class. There's a global pandemic, so I'm back in Tacloban, compiling all your columns. I wonder where the next adventure is. You never said goodbye. So, Tay, ingat.
That was so beautiful, Lakan, so touching. And to close this pagdiriwan for Ed Alegre's book, let us invite Professor Joycie Dorado Alegre, wife and partner of our author, who quietly persisted over time in having Ed Alegre's book published 11 years after he passed away. Let's welcome Professor Joycie Dorado Alegre from UP Tacloban.
Hello, can you hear me? Alice, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I'll proceed. I'll read. If my internet goes down, well, you have a video. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Nahinog din ang panahon para mailunsad ang Biyaheng Pinoy, ang Mindanao Travelogue ni Edilberto Alegre. The time has ripened for the launching of this book. It took 30 years since he journeyed south and 11 years since his passing. 3 decades to put his manuscript in good order for publication. He set forth on that journey to answer his own questions. He found some answers, and there were new questions. And then some issues were from conversations made with Dr. Covar, his favorite guru. Nakikiraan lang po tayo sa buhay. We are just passing through life. Life is but a stopover. At sa ating pagdaan, maaari tayong may nakakaugnay, nakakaisang loob at sana'y walang nasasaktan. Sa kanyang pagdaan sa iba't ibang puok ng Mindanao, may mga dating kaibigan at mga naging kaibigan at manggap sa kanya, sa kanilang tahanan. Sa mga ugnayang yun, siya'y maraming natutunan. Matingkad po sa aking alaala si Dato sa Palau, Dato ng Kirantakan, Menuvo Aromano ng Bentangan, Carmen, North Cotabato. Sumakabilang buhay na po siya. Si Kagi Sahara, magaling maghabi ng inaul para sa malong. Siya ay Iranon Maguindanao, katutubo ng Cotabato. Dinuksan nila ang kanilang tahanan at buhay na naging aralin para kay Eddie. At ang mga aral mula doon ang kanyang sinulat para sa ating sariling pag-unawa. Kahit nauna nang humayo si Eddie, meron naman siyang inihabilin at ipinamana. Nabanggit po ito ni Dr. Covar, ang galak at tuwa sa pagtuklas ng mga bagay-bagay sa paglalakbay at di kalaunay ang pagtuklas ng ating pambansang kultura. Kinakailangan po lamang tingnan natin ang ating pagkakatulad kaysa sa ating pagkakaiba. We are truly more similar than different from each other. Those are Eddie's words. Sa matagumpay na pagtitipon natin ito, taus-puso po ako nagpapasalamat sa mga kagalang-galang nating mga tagapagsalita. Brother Carl Gaspar, forward author, anthropologist for excellence, ground worker in Mindanao for the piercing and riveting tragic situation stated. Miss Felice Santa Maria, lead historian of the Philippines, for her fine recollection, remembering Doreen and Ed and the heartwarming appreciation. Thank you so much. Prof. J. Joe Marquintos, remarkable young professor of literature and Philippine studies, who did an astute literary analysis of Ed's writing. Dr. Mary Jane Rodriguez Tatel, dalubhasa sa pagsusuri ng wikang Filipino at buhay katutubo. Maraming salamat sa pag-alala sa pangalang Midsingatao. At ngayon ay apo na, naging ninuno na si Eddie. Napakalalim na napakalawak ng iyong ibinahagi, Doc Mary Jane. Sa iba pang mga kasapi sa pagdiriwang natin ngayon, sina Lydia and Lumbos Pobre para sa kanyang handog na awit, Norma Ali Kunanan sa makahulugang mensahe, Yupian Balangao, masayang video, Lakan Uhay Dorado Alegre, aking kaisa-isang anak sa bagong tulang alay sa kanyang tatay. Alice Pañares, my bosom friend, former NCCA Commissioner for Cultural Dissemination, our lively program host. Meron po tayong mga special thanks to people behind the scene. Dr. Jovi Peregrino of UP, Danica Ibanez, Jose Encina Jr. of Leyte Normal University, and film director Ticoy Aguiluz for a video that we will view in a while. I hope we still have time for that video. Ngayon, naging masigasig po dahil sa ating Ateneo Press Book Event Team. Almira Manduriao ang coordinator, Carla Micaela Escueta ang our technical assistant, and the rest of the staff. Our book publication team, Cristina Castro, Paulo Tiausas, and Nadine Legaspi and their partners. Jonas Lechuga, my nephew, book cover graphics designer. Masaya po ang cover na yan. Raymond Fernandez, with whom Eddie shared the initial cover design. Stella Ocampo Fernandez, my soul sister, who did the elegant book design. Ricardo de Ungria, my good friend, who edited and pruned Ed's drafts. Maria Karina Velasco, Ateneo Press Director, the moving force behind this book project and this event. Mainit na pagpupugay po sa kagalang-galang na guro ng mga guro, Dr. Prospero Covar. Ninong Poping, minamahal namin kayo. Salamat din po sa inyong may bahay, Ninang Miriam at ang inyong pamilya. Binibigyang pugay ko din po sina Alejo Reyes, Sanlito Ebueva at Sisa Cultural Association of the Philippines sa malaking tulong at aking mga kapatid Jocelyn at Joaquin Dorado sa kanilang suporta. Ngayon ay mahalaga pong mapagpasalamat, mabuhay po ang Ateneo de Manila University Administration sa patuloy na paglilimbag ng mga libro kahit sa mahirap na panahon natin ngayon. Mabuhay po sa inyong ginawa at sa inyong lahat po na nakaisa dito sa ating pag-uusap-usap at pagnilay na rin. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. At this point, we will share with you, may oras pa ata tayong kaunti, ang isang short film na nagmula sa isang video documentary na ginawa ni Jose Encina Jr. Si Ed po ito na binabasa ang kanyang tula. At ito ay ginawa pong special video tribute ng ating film director Amable Ticoy Aguiluz, Eddie's star student in literature. It is a rendition of Eddie reading his poem, Paglalala. Paglalala is a Tagalog word which means weaving. Sa waray, paglara. Eddie appropriated the weaving of the pandan mats by the Bajau in Sanga-Sanga, Tawi-Tawi. And he made it into a poem. Ayon kay Direk Ticoy Aguiluz, dapat marinig ang tinig ng manunulat. Narito po si Ed Alegre, Apo, Midsingatao, Eddie, sa pagbasa ng kanyang tula, Paglalala.
Paglalala. Sa paglalala, kukuha ka ng hibla. Ipapatong mo ang isa sa isa, isusuksok mo ang isa sa isa. Alam mo kung alin ang alin, ngunit ikaw lang ang nakakaalam. Ng hibla ng nakaraan, hibla ng kasalukuyan, hibla ng panaginip, hibla ng katotohanan. Ikaw lang. Ikaw lang ang magsusulong. Ikaw lang ang maglalala sapagkat iyong iyo lang. Ang hibla ng nakaraan, ang hibla ng kasalukuyan, ang hibla ng panaginip, at hibla ng katotohanan. Kung bilog ang lalalain mo, magsisimula ka sa gitna. Papalabas. Painog, paikot-ikot. Ngunit may tinutungo. Mahirap bumuo ng bilog sapagkat ikaw din ay gagalaw ng painog at paikot. Mula sa gitna sa pusod ng bilog at nilalala, binubuo ang hibla ng inyong nakaraan, hibla ng kasalukuyan, hibla ng panaginip, hibla ng katotohanan. Ang pinakamainam ay nakatuong ka sa ginagawa mo. Ang daliri mo't isip, magkasa. Wala kang maririnig. Walang iba kundi ikaw at ang iyong nilalala. May hibla ng nakaraan, hibla ng kasalukuyan, hibla ng panaginip, hibla ng katotohanan. Patuloy ka bumubuo, patuloy ka nabubuo. At ang gitnang simula'y parisukat, ngayon may tadyang na't himaymay, patuloy ka pa rin, umiinog, iniinog, lumalala, nilalala. At kayong dalawa, hibla ng nakaraan, hibla ng kasalukuyan, hibla ng panaginip, hibla ng katotohanan. At mabubuo nga kayong dalawa. Hihinga ka ng malalim, ihitid ka ng sigarilyo, tutunghayan mo ang iyong ginawa. Narong ka sa loob ng bilog na hibla, narong ka sapagkat ikaw ay kasabi na rin. Hibla ng nakaraan, hibla ng kasalukuyan, hibla ng panaginip, hibla ng katotohanan. At di na hibla pag nabuo na. Buo na itong benig, bilog na buo, buong buo, buong bilog. Tatanungin mo, sapagkat buo na, alin ang hibla ng nakaraan? Alin ang hibla ng kasalukuyan? Alin ang hibla ng panaginip? Alin ang hibla ng katotohanan? At kung parisukat naman ang lalalain mo, magsisimula ka sa isang sulok. Patuwid, taas, halang, makanan. Isusuksok mo ang isa sa isa, pailalim, tulad ng paglulubid ng alon. Magkakahawig man ang hilatsa ng hibla, iba naman ang kulay. Kulay ng panahon, kulay ng karanasan, kulay ng paligid, kulay ng kaalam. At kung mararamdaman mong hindi lapat na lapat, yung bang may nakaumbok, may nakalihis, kakalasin mong isa-isa ang hibla at babalik ka sa pinagsimulan ng iyong kamalian. Sapagkat ang nais mo ay ang kulay ng panahon, kulay ng karanasan, kulay ng paligid, kulay ng kaalaman. Susulong ka ulit, halos hindi humihinga. Wala ka na ngayong nakikita maliban sa iyong nilalala. Maingat ka na sapagkat ayaw mo nang magkamali. Ang nais mo ay pantay na pagsulong, makabuluhang ugnayang na may kulay at walang kulay. Ang hanap mo ay paglitaw ng linaw, ng kulay ng panahon, kulay ng karanasan, kulay ng paligid, kulay ng kaalaman. Pag nabuo mo na ang parisukat, hindi mo puputulin ang mga hibla. Wakos, titiklupin mo at ilalala sa ilalim at huhugutin mo lamang pagdating ng pangangailangan. Doon naman, sa tungkalang, sangga-sangga, sa tawi-tawi, naglalala araw-araw ang mga babaeng badyaw. May panahon ng pagkuha ng pandan, paghimay ng dahon, pagpapatuyo, pagkukulay ng dahon. Ngunit sa mga panahon din yun, tuloy-tuloy sila araw-araw sa kanilang paglalala. Bakit kayo naglalala araw-araw? Ang tanong ko sa pinakamatanda. Ang sagot niya, ang aming mga lalaki mandaragat, kami maglalala. Itong nilalala namin ay ang aming dagat. Dagdag pa niya. Ang paglalala para sa kanila ay pagbubuo ng sariling paglalakbay sa dagat ng panahon, sa kalawakan ng damdamin, sa kalaliman ng unayan. At nang nagkahulihan na kaming dalawa ng loob, inilatag niya ang kanyang mga nilala. Hindi niya ito pinagbibili, sapagkat ito ay ang kanyang paglalakbay. Lahat ng nilala niya ay alay sa asawa, sa anak, sa apo, sa kapatid, sa kamag-anak. Naglakbay siya ng malayo upang mapalapit. Naglakbay siya ng matagal. At nang malapit na kami sa isa't isa, inilatag niya ang kaisa-isa, pinakatatago niya, iisang kulay ito, puting nilala sa puti. Ang sabi niya, para sa aking kamatayan ito, diyan ako babalutin. At kanyang itinago na kangiti. Nalala na niya ang lahat ng kanyang pag-aalay. Nalala niya ang kamatayan. Nalala na rin niya ang kanyang paglalakbay. Sa dagat ng panahon, sa kalawakan ng damdamin, sa kalaliman ng ugnayan. At ano nga ba ang aming lalalain? Hibla ng nakaraan, hulay ng panahon, hibla ng kasalukuyan, hulay ng karanasan, hibla ng panaginip, hulay ng paligid, hibla ng katotohanan, hulay ng kaalaman. Sa dagat ng panahon, sa kalawakan ng damdamin, sa kalaliman ng ugnayan. Thank you. Thank you.
Beautiful. That was so beautiful. Thank you, Ed. You are still here with us, even if you're gone. So, surely, this pagdiriwang for Edilberto Alegre's book, Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue, I'm sure intrigued and fascinated all of you. And like me, I'm sure you would want to read this book of 500 pages that covers food, languages, markets, rituals, and ways of traveling and peoples of Mindanao, and Edilberto Alegre's personal reflection on this. For all of you today, the Ateneo University Press is giving a 15% discount for each copy. This promo is valid today until February 22nd. So, please go to the Ateneo University Press Lazada store and click Biyaheng Pinoy or email Ateneo University Press. As you will see here in the poster, you can get them at books.unipress@ateneo.edu. All the details are in the poster, or please look for Ateneo University Press in Facebook or YouTube. So, in behalf of Ateneo University Press and Joycie and Alegre, thank you everyone for joining us in this pagdiriwang for Edilberto Alegre's Biyaheng Pinoy, a Mindanao Travelogue. I hope you enjoyed the pagdiriwang as much as I did. Thank you and goodbye.